Welcome to Novelist Spotlight, the podcast where published fiction writers are interviewed to gather their insights and writing lessons so we can use them to make ourselves better and more effective writers. There are just 3 things I ask of you, if appropriate to you and your experience. Please subscribe, please click on the like button, and please share this program link with any family members, friends, or colleagues who might be interested or benefit from the content. Now, on with our program. This is Mike Council, your host. In the spotlight is Anne Gracie. She is joining all the way from Australia, the land down under. She wrote her first novel on notebooks that she bought in Quebec, Spain, Greece, and Indonesia. That story never made it out of the notebooks, but I'll tell you what, it must have been a lot of good practice because a lot has made it out since then. She said that when she did that, she was bitten by the writing bug, and then she discovered romance, and the rest is history. Anne Gracie, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mike. I'm really pleased to be here.
You discovered romance. First of all, I don't want to assume that everybody thinks in terms of romance the same way. What is romance in Anne Gracie's writing world, or even in your personal world?
Well, in my writing world, it's a story with a happy ending. I set most of my books, all but one really, in the Regency era, the English Regency era, which is, you know, Jane Austen, the madness of King George III, that kind of Georgette Heyer, that kind of era. And you know, I'm a big fan of a happy ending, so I really like writing. I didn't expect to like romance, but when I started specifically reading it, I hadn't realized that a lot of the books that I had read were actually romance. But when I started specifically reading, I just really liked the feel-good factor. And I think that's only become stronger in the last few years, particularly. I think there's some rotten things happening in the world, and we need a bit of a break from, the gloom and doom and misery on the news. And we need to escape every now and then to a happier place to sort of rebalance the emotions a bit.
Yeah, and yet romance so often goes badly. So often romance books, and the formulaic ones anyway, it's kind of, and you're not a formulaic writer, but say the Harlequin romances, which give your type of writing a bad name, I would suspect, unless people really know you.
No, I would disagree with you there, because
Oh, yeah? Tell me.
It's formulaic in the sense that crime writers, write formulaic. It's really the Harlequin books. And I started with Harlequin writing historicals, and nobody ever told me what to write. No editor ever told me what to write.
But didn't they send you the formula? They didn't send you a
No,
formula?
that is a myth. It is a complete myth. It came about a number of years ago when Harlequin first published their guidelines. Okay, and writers all over the place who didn't understand the genre said, "Oh, this is formula. This is telling writers what to do." But if you actually go onto a Harlequin website, I presume they still have them up there, what you realise is that each one is kind of like a description of the flavour of that line of books, because they have something like 15 different lines of books. So they might say that, you know, this one has a tendency to use as heroes princes, billionaires, that sort of thing.
Right.
And whereas this line is a much sweeter, more everyday story with people you might find next door, that kind of thing. Since Harlequin did publish those guidelines, heaps of publishers have come out and said, this is the kind of book we're looking for at the moment. And that's exactly what Harlequin did, that's all. But the myth that there's a formula is just not true. I've been fascinated by it. In fact, I've got an article about it. It's quite an old article, but it still works on my website. I was fascinated by the idea at first because I came from a more literary background. And when I was first published, I grilled a whole lot of the older Mills and Boon, Harlequin writers, and they said, "Yeah, no, there's never been a formula." And the descriptions are sort of just they came about when Harlequin started putting particular authors into particular lines, whereas before it just depended on what sort of story they wrote. They'd pop them into this line or that, whichever suited it.
Well, now, I mean, it's a huge genre. It is.
Yep.
I mean, romance is huge, and the readers are mostly women, and they expect certain things. They expect a strapping young man, right, and some kind of interlocutor who comes along. There's a bad situation that maybe they're assuaging, and but something goes wrong. Things go sideways, but they come back together by the end. And there's a million different ways you can do that.
Yeah.
And your background, you say, is literary, so you obviously don't treat it as slapdash. By the way,
No.
just one of the impressive things on your website, I see the foreign translations range from Argentina to Thailand and others,
Yeah.
Russia, Portugal, Indonesia, Holland. So your books are in a lot of different languages.
That's right.
Tell me what drew you. I'm not sure that we've really zeroed in on what is it about romance that, I mean, have you had a lot of romance in your life? What drew you to romance?
No,
the
not
writing of
particularly. Well,
romance?
no more or less than anyone else, really. But
Do you think some romance writers compensate for lack of romance in their lives? And I'm not saying you lack any romance in your life. I don't know your personal situation, but do you think some compensate? Just as an international espionage writer might say, my writing life is more exciting than my real life because I'm an international spy or
that's the case
whatever.
for a lot of writers, but I really think that it's not. It's another myth that most romance writers are, writing to compensate for their miserable or lonely lives or something
I'm
like
not
that.
accusing romance writers of being sexually frustrated.
No. But I do think that to write romance successfully, you have to have loved and loved well. You've got to understand it. You've got to understand how it works. And that's not just how it works, but it's also how it can fall apart.
There's a lot of people out. I'm sorry, I cut you off, but there's a lot of people out there who I think don't know what it is to be loved well. They wonder if they've ever been loved well. Have I been in a really rewarding relationship, or have I always really ended up with kind of the frog? What is a reward? Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's
not the same for
everyone,
everybody. I get that part, but I think that probably your description would resonate with certain people. They know that, hey, that resonates, or, I've never had that, and why not? I better get an Anne Gracie book and live it, at least in the, cerebellum.
Well, look, it's very hard. I mean, you can't exactly describe, what love is for everybody. I think people search for someone who just really gets them and who appreciates their uniqueness and who will listen to them and who will exchange thoughts with them. And, it's a gradual growth in intimacy, not just meaning physical intimacy, of course, but emotional intimacy. The person that you have loved the longest, and if you're still in that relationship, that's kind of what it is. It's the sharing of that joint vision of what it can be. But the trouble is, well, not the trouble, but the thing is that a lot of people don't realize that you really have to work at relationships. They're not just magically sort of, a bit of fairy dust comes down from the sky and bingo, you're in love. I mean, that can happen, of course, but then after that, you have to sort out an awful lot between, your partner and yourself.
Wow, you cut out for a while and I didn't
And
even hear
that's
what you.
often what romance writers, what a romance is about. It's about bringing two people together who have a strong attraction, but who have barriers to following up that strong attraction. For instance, like, okay, I use my parents. My parents basically were that fall in love at first sight situation, and they were happily married for the rest of their lives, and they were a very romantic couple. When I was a teenager, and I was the youngest in a large family, and so when my teenage friends were around at my place, my parents were quite a lot older than their parents. And they were shocked to find things, mum and dad having a kiss in the corner, or dancing in the if mum had the radio on in the kitchen and dad had come in, he'd swing her into a dance, that kind of thing. And my teenage friends were sort of, oh God, oh, that's your parents. But that's, some people are romantic and some people are not. But whether you're romantic or not does not mean that you can't have a fabulous love in your life.
Right.
Does
Right.
that help?
You're married, is that correct?
No, I'm not.
Yeah. Have you been married?
No, but I have long-term relationships.
Yeah. Okay. It's you and your notebooks are primary, maybe, but interesting. So talk a little bit about, I can't talk to somebody about romance novels without saying, what are the essentials of a good sex scene?
Well, for a start, a good romance novel doesn't necessarily need a good sex scene. There are lots of writers who write wonderful romances with no explicit sex. And my first love in romance novels, although at the time I didn't realise they were romance novel, was Georgette Heyer. And her books, there was no explicit sex, barely even a kiss in some cases. But I think with us, if you're writing a sex scene, you've got to make it relevant to the journey each person is making, and it has to mean something beyond, oh, they're having sex. You don't
It can't be
decide, all right,
gratuitous.
I've had a bit of, I've had these things happen, now let's have some sex. If it doesn't arise from the plot and from the stage that the characters are at, it shouldn't be there.
Well, you see, I grew up with three older sisters, one of which was a Rosemary Rogers fan. And I think she was reading Sweet Savage Love at the time. And I picked it up one day, and I'm not really a romance reader by and large. I mean, I love romantic writing and all that, but picked that up, and that was quite steamy. Rosemary Rogers was a steamy writer.
Sure.
But I get what you're saying. Intimacy, and this is something all women know, but a lot of guys don't really understand, is intimacy is, in fact, I would say an awful lot of women, maybe a majority of women would say the most intimate times in their life have nothing to do with sex, but it has to do with other sorts of openness and closeness and so on. So I completely get the whole idea that you can write a beautiful and connective romance novel without a sex scene in it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you are traveling to some interesting places. You grew up kind of, from what I was reading in your biography, Annie, you grew up fairly poor, and yet you were traveling. I may be right, you correct anything I'm going to say wrong here, but I noticed that you, the notebooks that you got, you were in some interesting places like Quebec, and I'm trying to get back to that. I'm trying to get back to my page, which is right here, where I've got all my, Spain and Greece and Indonesia. These are some very interesting places. What were you doing traveling there at the time?
Yes, well, I didn't exactly grow up very poor. Both my parents were teachers. My dad was a school principal. But in the very early years of my life, until I was about 4 or 5, We lived in the country in a little house with no electricity and no town water or something. You know, we were a bit isolated, and my parents were very much doing a back to the land kind of thing. So we had a couple of cows, which gave us milk. We had a couple of goats. We had hundreds of chickens and ducks. My mum was fairly amazing because she had 4 kids in this situation, doing everything by hand. I mean, washing by hand, you know, cooking on a wood-fired stove, and we get hot in summer, I tell you. And doing everything by hand without electricity, and teaching a class full of 56-year-olds.
A class with how many? What age did you say?
50
people.
6-year-olds.
56-year-olds. Okay, gotcha. All right, that's
not old people, little people. Yeah. And heaps of those kids were learning English while she was teaching them. So she just did an amazing job. That's all I'm saying. And then when I was traveling, we moved a lot of places because Mum and Dad had itchy feet. So when I was 7, Dad did an exchange with a Scottish teacher, and we lived in Scotland for a year, and I went to school in Scotland, and Mum and Dad taught in Scotland, and my older siblings went to high school in Scotland. And then we moved quite a lot around Australia because every 2 or 3 years Dad would apply for promotion and get it. He's pretty good. Then later on, when I was a young adult, we've got this system in Australia called long service leave. And I had a scholarship to study at university from the education department, and we were required to teach for 3 years in an education department school after we graduated. And so my period of being able to apply for long service leave came up pretty fast. And so I was able to take 3 months fully paid leave or 6 months unpaid leave, and I saved up for the rest. So I took a year off work and travelled, and I got a round the world ticket, starting with going from here to Hawaii, then to Vancouver, and then I travelled. I think I went back to San Francisco and LA, and then across the US. I travelled quite a bit in the northwest of Canada, right up to Prince Rupert and those areas. And then I travelled across the US and scooted around a few places there, went up into Quebec and saw a bit of Eastern Canada. Then I went to the UK and revisited some places and went to a few other places that I hadn't ever visited. And then I went through Europe on a Ural pass, and that's when I started writing. I started writing in Quebec.
So you were what, about 20?
In France and more in Greece. But then later, Mum and Dad moved to Penang, which is in Malaysia. I think that was before I started traveling. And then I also spent 6 months in Greece with some friends when we were, I was 20 at the time. So, I've had a kind of international approach in my life.
Yes, I would say so. So you got the notebooks and started writing when you were about, what, 20 years old?
No, much older than that, more like 30 something.
Okay, so, the notebooks, obviously you handwrite with notebooks, and you're an advocate of the power of handwriting. Talk about that. What's the magic of handwriting versus working at a keyboard?
Well, I came back, I initially was handwriting when I was traveling because I wasn't traveling with a computer. In fact, I don't think I even owned a computer at that point. And so, you know, writing in a notebook was all, you know, my only option. And then I was writing on a computer, but I'm not a natural typist. Well, I never learnt typing at school. And I'm a two-finger typist. I'm quite fast, but I'm not that accurate. So, but I am very picky about spelling. And so I found what I was doing. I was typing, and then I'd look at it and think, oh, and I'd have to go back and correct all the little mistakes. And so it threw me out of my, what's the word? You know, the flow of the writing.
Yes.
So then I took to writing in a notebook, and I've got hundreds of notebooks these days. And I just call it my scribble, and it's handwriting. And often it's, you know, I'm setting up a scene and I'm not sure where I'm going to write. So I ask myself a few questions about the next scene, and then I answer them as well. And then suddenly I'm writing, and I'm writing mainly dialogue as it comes to life in my head. Mm-hmm. And so I scribble all that down, and then I type that up. And in the typing up, it gets polished. The bits between the dialogue, you know, are added in. And so 3 pages of my scribble will turn out to be 1,000 words or so. There is a scientific theory about the hand-eye brain connection. And when you're writing with your hand, it's almost a direct flow from your brain. Whereas if you're going through a machine like a computer or a keyboard, then it's a separate step. And I believe in that, but I'm not sure whether that's the case for the kids who grew up with keyboards.
Yeah. They don't even teach cursive anymore. So to handwrite is a really mechanical sort of thing these days, because kids don't even write cursive.
Yep.
In fact, if you hand a kid a handwritten note, they will sometimes say, could you tell me what this says? I can't read it.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a lost, just like calligraphy became a lost art, simply cursive is becoming kind of a lost art.
As is the writing of letters.
Yes. I mean,
I've
sometimes even call
full
emails.
Of old letters. Well, a friend of mine just gave me a whole bunch of letters that I had sent to her when I was traveling. But you know, these days I've got great emails from people. They're all on old computers, most of which I don't have anymore.
Now you're on a computer right now, so you have a computer. You handwrite. And as you go, you're from day to day, week to week, you are moving copy over to electronic form. So you never have to worry about a notebook suddenly disappears somehow. What happened to my notebook?
Well, I have just as much worry about a file getting.
But you can put it in the cloud. I mean, you can put it in Dropbox or.
Yeah.
So there's backup at least there. You also talk about microtension. Explain that, please. What is microtension in writing?
Okay, that I discovered that through the wonderful agent and writing teacher Donald Maass. Microtension is the tension within a few paragraphs or on a page, just raising questions in the reader's mind about, what's going to happen next. And a demonstration, he demonstrated this many years ago. He came to Australia at an invitation from Romance Writers of Australia. I have to declare now that I'm a former president of that organisation and a lifetime member, so I'm biased. Anyway, he ran a masterclass, and the only people who were allowed to do the masterclass were people who had finished a manuscript. So you didn't have to be published at that point or anything. You just had to have finished a manuscript, and you had to bring that manuscript into the workshop. So he would do things like he would say, okay, open to page 65. So we all opened to whatever page 65 was. And he says, now find a way to make it worse, make some situation in that worse and more dramatic. And you would. And then, turn to page 28 and do the same thing, and then turn to page whatever. And it was an eye-opener. I really felt that looking at not just the overall tension, the rise and fall of tension in the book, but small little bits of tension throughout the story was just a really wonderful little tool. So if people are more interested in it, go and Google Donald Maass microtension. I mean, a lot of people are now using the term, but I've heard it first from him, and I think he coined the term.
Now, for our listeners, as always, I have in the episode notes Annie's URL to her website, so you can see all of her books. And one of the other things that you'll find there is that she has online writing clinics, and also a blog that contains writing advice and so on.
I have some articles on my website too, writing articles.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
When did you first consider yourself or call yourself a writer?
Yeah, no, I never called myself a writer. When people say, oh, what do you do? I didn't call myself a writer until I was published twice because I'd become fed up with all these people saying, oh, I'm a writer, and taking workshops and stuff, and they hadn't written anything. Mm-hmm. And I just think, yeah, no, because there's a big difference between knowing things in theory and being able to make them work in practice. So, yeah, I was very careful not to call myself a writer until I was published, because people are a bit skeptical. So they'll say, oh, what do you do? And these days I say I'm a writer, and they say, oh, yeah, what do you write? And I say romantic novels. And they say, oh, yeah, well, have you been published? Or no, they usually say, have I heard of you? And I think, no, probably not. Have you been published? And I say, yes. And oh yeah, and so it goes on like that. There's, I come from a cynical country, so people don't sort of jump off and say, oh, that's wonderful. So yeah.
Well, nowadays there's a lot of cynicism around writing anyway, because there's the traditionally published writers, and there's the self-published authors, and there are a lot of people who call themselves writers or artists or anything like that, and they haven't really produced anything that's really tangible.
To be fair, there's also a thought that I think is fair enough too. It's just that it's not mine. That if you write, you're a writer. So if someone is writing in a journal every day, other people would call that a writer. Mm-hmm. So I was being asked what I do in the context of what my job was. And so my job, once I was published, then my job became writing. So, but I've been a writer in a just general writing sense all my life. Right. I used to write long letters when I was traveling, and even when I wasn't. And to lots of people, I was quite surprised when my friend gave me this really thick bundle of letters, and it was just for, I don't know how long I'd been away that time. But when I've done a lot of traveling on my own, and when you're on your own, particularly if you're in countries where you don't speak the language, things are happening that you want to share with people. So you write it.
Yes.
And I kept writing diaries as well as letters.
What time of day do you have are you systemic with your writing? Is it I get up in the morning, or is it I stay up, after sundown when everybody's in bed and I write? Or do you catch as catch can?
No, I do. I have a reasonable routine. I write in the morning, and the closer my deadline gets, the less I'm restricted to writing just in the morning. I'll write any time of day, but I always start in the morning. I think that's when my brain is freshest. And look, quite often, if once the story's spinning in my head, I will either be drifting off to sleep or just waking up in the morning, and there's a scene rolling in my brain a bit like a movie. And so quite a long time ago, I took to sleeping with a notebook beside the bed, and if that happens, I will write down the scene as it's coming to me, and there's pages of dialogue, sometimes all sorts of things. And some of the scenes that people like best in my books, some dramatic scenes or whatever, I've got virtually almost word for word in notebooks.
Really?
So harnessing that between sleep and waking dream time state is absolute gold when it happens.
Right. You're in an alpha brainwave frequency. I mean, scientifically speaking, you're probably in an alpha brainwave frequency. And yeah, that dream state or that quasi dream state is something that can be very powerful.
Yeah. Well, some of the examples of some of the scenes that came, look, my very, very, very first book, which was called Gallant Waif, there is a dramatic ballroom scene in that, which was the scene that came to me in that dream state. And then I realized I wanted to write this story, but I had to think, who are these people? Where did they come from to get to this point? And that particular scene comes really close to the end of the book. But then another one that came to me in the same sort of way was the scene in The Autumn Bride where my heroine climbs through a window intent on stealing something small because they're absolutely broke and desperate, and comes across a bedridden old lady in a really miserable state. And that then, that was the start of a series, and that then affected the rest of that story.
You know, for our listeners, I've been calling Annie, but the actual name, her authorial name on the books is Anne, Anne Gracie. Is that a pseudonym? I won't tell people what your real name is if it is.
The surname is, yeah.
It is a pseudonym, yeah, because Gracie sounds like a perfect. I mean, it's as soon as I saw it, I was thinking of those
it
terms.
was the surname of a friend of mine, but it's also a family name. My dad's side of the family is Scottish, and Gracie is a Scottish name.
Now, did you choose that, or did you bounce that off of
an agent? No, I did, and I did it because back in the day when I didn't really know about how the US market worked, and I had written to US publishers offering them my Regency, and they wrote back saying, no, we're not publishing Regencies. And I didn't realise that the term Regency to a lot of US publishers meant Sweet Regency, and if I'd called it Historical Regency, they would have looked at it. So I took it to Mills and Boon, which is the English section of Harlequin, and at that stage, people were finding it very. A lot of Harlequin authors were using pseudonyms, and so I went with that. And plus, I also thought that I might someday go back to my literary story that I had been writing before I took to romance.
I see. Now, do you write under a different name, your literary stuff, or are you strictly romance?
No, I never went back to it. I fell in love with the romance genre.
Now, you've written quite a bit now. Do you ever feel like this? Look, I've created a lot of male and female characters, and I guess what I'm getting at, Annie, is do you ever feel hamstrung by being a genre writer, particularly maybe a romance writer, because you're going to have the female character, you're going to have the male character, and you've probably used an awful lot of different characteristics for each. Do you ever feel that you're running out of marks of distinction for your characters?
No, because I don't I don't make them up like that. I'll write and write and write, and then suddenly a character's come to life, and I just follow them. So I don't sit down and think, okay, this one's going to be like this and this and this, and that one's going to be have that. So I don't do it like that. And so I don't feel repetitive in that sense, or blocked, as to choice. It's really like, if you ask all your friends, how did they get to be with their partner? Every story is different, and all the friends are different, and it's a bit like that.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
I don't use, there are some people who use character archetypes. Others might use astrology types. I don't do anything like that. Look, I was raised on Georgette Heyer, and every single one of her characters, major or minor, are come to life and are wonderful. So that's what I strive for.
Well, because you write period pieces, you also never have these people meeting through online dating. That's not part of the scene.
No, it's not. But the marriage of convenience is a very nice trope to play with too.
And the arranged marriage, is that what you mean when you say marriage of convenience? As in,
well, they can be arranged. They can just also be an agreement between the two people concerned. Because in those days, people did marry for love, but they also married for position and for
family name,
fortune, and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So even within the one narrow trope, there's an awful lot of choice.
Don't you think even today that that a lot of people, it's almost that they look for somebody to love, that they're going to fall head over heels in love with, and they maybe would have done better if they made a practical choice. They would have looked at a person and said, what is this person bringing to the table? What would our lives be like together? Maybe it's not a scorching hot romance. Maybe it's not what they had envisioned when they were a teenager, thinking this is the kind of life I'm going to live, or the kind of spouse I'm going to have. I see people, and I'm sure you've seen this, where they keep making the same mistake over and over again, where they keep picking a person who is emotionally a lot of times women pick a man who's emotionally unavailable. A man will pick a woman who's hyper dramatic, and it causes a lot of issues. I mean, those are just two of many, but sure. I think people approach romance sometimes in the very much in the Harlequin sense, rather than maybe what needs to be. And I'm not, I might be mischaracterizing.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
So yeah, look, correct me if I'm wrong. But
yeah, look, I think there are a couple of things in play there. One is that people tend to, they're affected often subconsciously by their own upbringing, and so they might be subconsciously seeking somebody like their mother who was not a great mother, or their father who was not a great father, and they're sort of subconsciously looking to make that up. The other thing is that I think there's a lot of power in that strong sexual attraction, but then people need to understand that that is going to change over time to a degree, and that you need to work at making a relationship work. And a lot of people just think, yeah, no, that's not good, I'm going to, stop this. And I don't think people have the patience necessarily to try and work through it. That said, if it's really bad, I think it's a good thing to walk away. So,
yeah, absolutely.
It's very hard to just, say something that's true for everybody.
You know, I will say that my wife says that with online dating, that as soon as either the passion wears off, the physical passion wears off, or they run into just a wrinkle in the relationship, it's very easy to simply go out there and look for somebody else. In fact,
Sure.
I think this is especially true of guys. Oftentimes they find a woman, but they never really stop looking. They're still out there. They got a left hand out there and they're dabbling in the marketplace. I think guys always tend to think in terms of maybe something better will come along. Although I've seen plenty of women who do that same thing where they think he's good man, but I think there might be somebody better for me. So everything is left on simmer all the time, and not in a way that serves the primary relationship or what's supposed to be a monogamous relationship. And so
Well,
I'm not talking about.
necessarily.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, well, look, a good friend of mine did a lot of online dating, and all of her friends found it very entertaining, hearing, all the different stories. And she met up with a guy that she really liked, and they really got on for a while there. And then he said, "Yeah, no, I think I need to sort of, explore a bit more." Anyway, he came back about a year later, and he said, "Look, I really miss you." And they got together, and they've been together for I don't know how many years now, and they have a child, and it worked out really well. So it doesn't have to be that way. As I say, you can't really make generalizations. But lots of people I know, oh, well, I can just think of 3 or 4 just off the top of my head of my personal friends who've met their partner online. And I don't think it's much difference from meeting them in a bar or at a party or at somebody's wedding or something like that, because people, with the online dating, I haven't never done it, so, I'm no expert. But it seems to me that they meet first for a coffee or a drink, and then, if they like each other a little bit, they'll move it up to a meal, say, or go to a movie or whatever. And it's just a different way of connecting. And when people are so busy with work these days, and work extends out of normal work hours, and often people are not, especially since COVID, people are not working in offices, they're working remotely. So where can they meet people? Online.
Well, you just described how my wife and I really the progression that we went through. We met online. My wife likes to say it the old-fashioned way on Match.com. We met online, but we were both coming out of long-term marriages, and we were on the rebound. And I said, we really need to see other people because we're on the rebound. I don't trust my judgment right now, and you shouldn't really trust your judgment. And we did very briefly, but every woman I was having a cup of coffee or glass of wine with bored me, was boring me, and by comparison, and we ended up. It was not nowhere near a year break. It was, and we never went out of touch with each other. But that's interesting that you say that, because that was very much my experience. So online dating absolutely can work, but there's no question about that. Most people, I think that's the number one way people meet these days. I think through online. It's hard to even date from work anymore because there's all kinds of rules and regulations around that these days, and you can get in trouble even trying. So there's that aspect. I noticed that you are writing romances. Your influences are stellar. I mean, Jane Austen. You've got P.D. James, Doris Lessing, Virginia Woolf. How much Dickens? How much of the reading that you've done through your life is actually incorporated into your own writing? I know that that's kind of a difficult question to answer, but do you ever feel that you're in a situation where you try to channel a particular author because they're right for a scene or a particular book?
No, I'm very wary of doing that. Look, I was a voracious reader from the time I could read, and my mother actually held me back from learning to read because she said if I could read before I started school, then I'd be making a nuisance of myself to whoever was teaching me. So, but basically 10 minutes after I started school, I was reading. But also before that, my parents and siblings read to me, and I have absorbed enormous amounts. I did a literary, my degree was in literature, English literature, and well, not just English, because, you know, we did Russians and all sorts, European, I suppose you'd call it. But probably the strongest literary influence I have for my books is Georgette Heyer, because she's the reason I'm writing Regency era. Her books are very clever. The plots are wonderful. Her characters are superb, and the dialogue is brilliant. And so, but I try not to copy her because I'm my own person.
Right.
So I'm influenced by that. Her style of Regency society is pretty much the same as my style, because the Regency society as it exists in romance is pretty varied. You know, you'll have well, there was the Regency that Julia Quinn had, you know, and we all make our own versions, right? So Julia Quinn wrote her kind of Regency, which then got morphed into the Bridgerton kind of Regency, which is nothing like, or very, you know, very little like hers. Georgette Heyer's was different again. Jane Austen was not writing historical, she was writing contemporaries, but she was setting her stories around the moneyed middle class, whereas Georgette Heyer's usually doing the aristocrats. So, but you know, I don't try and copy, but I do aspire to the wit of Georgette Heyer. I don't really achieve it, but I'm going to keep trying.
Right. Well, yeah, we want to be influenced, and obviously not, being influenced by the greatness of other people, other writers. So Georgette Heyer, Heyer, and I spell that last name because I've never read her. This is the first I've heard of her. I wanted to make sure that our listeners are.
Well, it's because she's English, I suppose, but she's hugely popular. And, you know, her books are quite variable. There was one book that was set, some of them are more historical than others. Some are more entertaining than historical, if you know what I mean. All her historical research was really good. But there are a lot of men read her as well and like her. And one of her books, which is one of my least favourites, because it's got huge amounts of detail about fighting in the Napoleonic Wars. That book was used in English training schools for officers. It was so good, you know. So, but
I'm gonna have to try her.
Yeah. Pick out some of her really popular ones, and they're all different too. You know, it's not like she followed the same tropes or, you know, whatever. They're not cookie cutters by any means.
Mm-hmm. Now, just in closing, yeah, you've had long-term relationships. You've never been married. I kind of get the sense that, you know, you're at a stage in life where if a man was in your life to that degree where he was living with you, the traditional marriage and living together, it probably maybe mess things up a little bit. You've got your rhythm to your life. You're writing. You need your time to write, and so on. Is there anything that you would identify that made you decide that the long-term relationships, the men are fine?
No,
but
not at all. It's not that at all. Look, it's probably two things. One, I haven't met the right person, and two, I don't really go out and I don't do online dating. So, you know, and to be honest, I'm really very content. I've got some wonderful friends. I've got a lot of friends well, there's real in-person friends that live fairly close, but there's also real friends who are quite distant, ranging from people in other states of Australia, and some of my really good friends are in the US and the UK. And
Yes.
because I can connect online with them or on the phone or whatever, you know, a lot of my social needs are met that way. I'm probably turning into a terrible hermit. I don't know. But you know, I'm not again, you know, if I met a gorgeous fellow and we clicked, yeah, no problem.
Have any of your suitors ever become characters or kind
No,
of composite characters in
no,
your
I
books?
don't.
No?
I don't use real people at all in my writing. I wrote a short story many years ago, not romance. It was just a straight short story based on a little story that my dad had told me about when he was a little kid. And I found it, you know, I couldn't use the real names in that because it was affecting, you know, I didn't know enough, you know, Auntie Bet. Oh, how can I write about Auntie Bet? Oh, I don't know enough about how she was back then, you know. And so I changed the name, and then I could create a person.
Right.
So the closest I've come is occasionally when I'm looking for the name of, you know, of someone, like, for instance, I think in the last book or the book before, they were going to somebody's ball, and I wanted to give a name to the husband and wife who were giving it. So I pinched the names of two friends of mine, a husband and wife, and just said, you know, just had you just use their name, but that it was not their personality. The closest I came was that Sir Alan Reynolds, who was the husband, I said that he was very tall, and the real Alan is very tall. That was the closest. The personalities, I was able to use them because all they did was say half a dozen things and be nice. You know, I didn't have to create a character to go with them. If I'm creating a character, I will not go anywhere near any real person.
Right, right. No, I understand. So Anne Gracie has been our guest. You can learn a lot more about her at annegracie.com. You can buy her books there. The URL to her website is in the episode notes below. Anne, thank you for taking the time. This was really interesting. You're the first real romance author that I've had on the program. And so it was really interesting you've also exploded some of the misconceptions and urban legends I've been harboring about romance writing. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Mike. Have a read of my, one of my writing articles is called The Myth of Romance. And, you know, that's, I think, worth reading if you have, you know, if you've heard some of the stories about, you know, how people are supposed to write romance. It's mostly not true. But thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely.